or after the 5th century tide, where Rome's last embers sank on the northern side. Our journey begins after Roman Britain had receded into a cold northern twilight. Around 410, the old imperial order withdraws. Roads remain, walls remain, but Rome itself has gone. A fractured island began to speak in new tongues. Out of this precarious world grew Old English literature, harsh, alliterative, elegiac, and bright with firelight. Its monumental survivor, Beowulf, preserved in a single manuscript, gives us Heorot, Grendel, Grendel's mother, and finally the dragon. This isn't merely a tale of monster slaying, though. To be fair, the monsters do their job with admirable professionalism. It's a poem about fame, mortality, lordship, loyalty, and the inexorable pressure of fate. Beowulf's final battle matters because he fights when victory can no longer save him. English literature begins with courage, but also with loss. Time flies like an arrow. Fruit flies like bananas. From the 8th to the 11th century, cloisters kept the page. Vellum, Latin psalm, saints, riddles, war, and age. After the hall fire came the monastery, a quieter room but no less dramatic. Think of Bede in the 8th century, with his Latin learning, biblical history, saintly lives, riddles, and charms. Vernacular fragments survived in the margins of a Christian manuscript world. The page became a palimpsest, Latin authority above, Old English memory beneath. Caedmon's hymn, traditionally associated with a 7th century Northumbrian cowherd inspired to sing of creation, reminds us that English poetry wasn't born in a university seminar. It began, more humbly and more wonderfully, with a man who was too embarrassed to sing until, in the story, a dream gave him a voice. That's a rather comforting origin myth for anyone who has ever feared karaoke. Rome wasn't built in a day. English literature wasn't built in 2 either. Then, in 1066, through sea wind and iron rain, Norman French entered the court. English went underground again. The Norman conquest didn't just change kings, it rearranged the hierarchy of language. Latin remained the language of the church and learned record. French became the language of court, law, aristocratic prestige, and chivalric culture. English survived in households, fields, markets, and local memory. Yet this apparent humiliation became an incubation. Medieval England turned multilingual, and English absorbed, borrowed, mutated, and returned stronger. Arthur's glass held Grail, Round Table, Quest, and Shame. Arthurian romance gathered together the Grail, Lancelot, Guinevere, honor, betrayal, penance, and spiritual testing. In Mallory's later Le Morte d'Arthur, printed by Caxton in 1485, the Round Table became both dream and ruin, a perfect fellowship undone by very human desire. Chaucer's Pilgrimage is basically a medieval group chat. The knight is serious, the miller is inappropriate, the pardoner is monetizing guilt, and nobody can mute anyone. Then Chaucer rode the 14th century road. Knight, miller, prioress, pardoner, each bore a human load. With the Canterbury Tales, written in the late 14th century, Chaucer stepped out of the cloister and onto the road. The pilgrims travel from the Tabard Inn in Southwark toward the shrine of St. Thomas Becket at Canterbury. The host proposes a storytelling contest because even medieval people apparently understood the need for entertainment on a long journey. Chaucer's genius lies in social range. The knight brings aristocratic memory, the miller brings rude vitality, the prioress performs delicate piety, and the pardoner sells salvation with a merchant's instinct. It's basically a medieval group chat, but in verse and on horseback. The crucial point is that Middle English became polyphonic. It could carry sermon, fablio, romance, confession, satire, and gossip. In the 15th century, Caxton's type took flight. Manuscripts stepped out of guarded candlelight. Around 1476, William Caxton's Westminster Press turned English writing into something more durable, repeatable, and public. Print didn't instantly produce modernity, but it altered the conditions under which literature survived. A manuscript could be singular, local, and vulnerable. A printed book could travel, multiply, and standardize. Caxton printed Chaucer, Mallory, translations, moral works, and practical texts, helping English become a medium of wider circulation. The change was material, but also symbolic. Literature left the guarded candle and entered the marketplace. This had one obvious danger. Once everyone could read, everyone could complain, but that too became part of literary history. English became not merely a local voice, but a public instrument. Faustus sold his soul for knowledge, power, and pleasure, which is why one should always read the contract before signing anything in blood. In the 16th century, Renaissance doors opened wide. Humanist learning, antique stars, ambition, pride. The Renaissance brought classical learning, rhetoric, moral philosophy, translation, theater, and the intoxicating belief that human beings might remake themselves through language. Spencer's The Faerie Queene turned virtue into allegory. The Red Cross Knight didn't merely ride through scenery. He traveled through moral architecture, where error, holiness, pride, and temptation became narrative figures. Marlowe's Dr. Faustus then gave us Renaissance hubris in theatrical form. Faustus wanted knowledge, power, pleasure, cosmic range. He also signed an extremely bad contract. The joke is easy. The tragedy is deeper. Marlowe asked what happens when human aspiration ceases to be noble and becomes overreaching. Hell, in this play, wasn't merely below. It opened inside the mind. Shakespeare gives us ghosts, daggers, poisoned cups, storms, mistaken identities, and family problems so severe that modern therapy would need several sequels. In Elizabethan Fire, Shakespeare raised the stage. Hamlet's question, Lear's storm, Macbeth's bloody age. He made the public theater a chamber of consciousness. Hamlet gives us to be or not to be, but the line matters because it's not a decorative quotation. It's thought hesitating on the edge of death. King Lear, first performed in the early Jacobean period, strips kingship down to storm, madness, nakedness, and filial cruelty. Macbeth turns political ambition into blood, prophecy, hallucination, and insomnia. Out, damned spot is not just a line, it's guilt trying and failing to wash itself clean. Shakespeare's tragedies endure because they don't separate public power from inward ruin. The crown is political. The wound is psychological. The stage lets both bleed at once. Across the 17th century, kings could fall. Don's compass lovers turned, and Herbert heard God call. It wasn't a quiet corridor. It gave us civil war, regicide, religious pressure, metaphysical wit, devotional austerity, and epic theology. Don's a valediction, forbidding mourning, famously compares separated lovers to the two legs of a compass, an audacious metaphysical conceit in which geometry becomes erotic fidelity. George Herbert's The Temple turned poetry into prayer, not vague spirituality, but disciplined lyric address. Love bade me welcome, and the soul hesitated at the door. Milton, blind and politically defeated, wrote Paradise Lost, first published in 1667, to justify the ways of God to men. Satan's defiance, Adam and Eve's choice, and the fall became questions of freedom, providence, rebellion, and responsibility. After 1660, Restoration stages grew bright. Comedy laughed at marriage, masks, appetite. With the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, the theaters reopened and English drama remembered desire with suspicious speed. Restoration comedy delighted in masks, intrigue, adultery, wit, and the theatrical sport of social hypocrisy. Upper-class romantic confusion, it turned out, was already a flourishing industry long before dating apps. Dryden wrote political satire and heroic drama. Neoclassical decorum valued balance, order, polished couplets, and public judgment. The 18th century coffeehouse then became a theater of print culture. Newspapers, pamphlets, literary clubs, argument, gossip, and caffeine, a dangerous combination in any century. Pope's The Rape of the Lock inflated a stolen curl of hair into mock epic grandeur. Swift's Gulliver's Travels shrank and enlarged humanity until pride looked ridiculous at every scale. Crusoe is shipwrecked on a deserted island and immediately starts counting, building, naming, storing, and organizing. Even solitude, apparently, needed administration. Gulliver changed scale and measured human pride. Crusoe counted grain on empire's lonely side. The 18th century novel entered where epic and tragedy rarely lingered: private life, habit, money, appetite, letters, labor, domestic virtue, and social mobility. Defoe's Robinson Crusoe from 1719 is a story of survival, calculation, providence, and colonial possession. Crusoe counts grain, builds shelter, names things, and turns an island into a ledger. Richardson's Pamela from 1740 opened inwardness through letters, virtue under pressure, and the drama of social vulnerability. Fielding's Tom Jones from 1749 ran in the opposite direction: outward, comic, bodily, accidental, crowded with appetite and motion. The novel's great innovation wasn't that it abandoned grandeur, it relocated grandeur into ordinary life. Private experience became historically visible. In 1798, the Lake District began to sing. Lyrical ballads gave common speech a luminous wing. Romanticism arrived with Wordsworth and Coleridge's 1798 volume, a book that helped make ordinary speech, rural life, feeling, memory, and imagination central to poetry. Wordsworth's famous wandering "lonely as a cloud" is often softened into postcard prettiness, but romantic inwardness was more radical than that. Nature became the mind's mirror, and memory became creative power. Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, with its dead albatross and spectral voyage, turned guilt into a burden that must be narrated. Byron supplied aristocratic defiance. Shelley addressed the west wind as revolutionary energy. Keats, in the Ode to a Nightingale, an ode on a Grecian urn, placed beauty beside mortality until both trembled. Victorian society was extremely concerned with respectability, which is why its novels are full of secrets, scandals, inheritances, unhappy marriages, and people behaving terribly behind curtains. Through the Victorian age, smoke, iron, profit, rain, the 19th century brought industrial modernity. Factories, railways, workhouses, empire, social reform, scientific disturbance, and religious doubt. Tennyson's In Memoriam, written after the death of Arthur Hallam and published in 1850, turned grief into a long meditation on faith, evolution, doubt, and consolation. Browning's My Last Duchess let a duke reveal his own tyranny while sounding impeccably civilized. Very few murderously possessive men have sounded so well-mannered. Dickens brought in children, debt, prisons, schools, factories, caricature, sentiment, and reforming anger. The Brontes brought the Moors. Jane Eyre claimed spiritual equality. Wuthering Heights made love elemental, destructive, almost weather-like. Hardy's Tess of the D'Urbervilles placed a vulnerable woman beneath law, desire, social judgment, and indifferent fate. In the early 20th century, Empire's sunset grew cold. Yeats saw the center break, the falcon lose its hold. Modernism was born from rupture. War, empire, urban anonymity, fractured belief, and the exhaustion of inherited forms. Yeats's Things Fall Apart, the center cannot hold, became a prophecy of historical disintegration. Eliot's The Waste Land, published in 1922, opened by calling April the cruelest month, turning spring itself into an ironic wound. The poem stitched myth, voices, pub chatter, ritual, fragments, and drought into a landscape of cultural collapse. Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway from 1925 opened a single day into memory, trauma, clocks, flowers, and consciousness. Joyce's Ulysses, also associated with modernism's 1922 Annus Mirabilis, made one day in Dublin epic, comic, obscene, erudite, and gloriously excessive. Lawrence pulled the novel toward body, class, instinct, and desire. After the two world wars, Orwell crossed the square. Power fabricated truth from language, fear, and air. Post-war writing inherited trauma and distrust. Orwell's 1984, published in 1949, gave us Big Brother, Newspeak, The Ministry of Truth, Doublethink, and Winston Smith rewriting history for a regime that fears memory. Its horror is linguistic as much as political. If words can be controlled, reality itself becomes precarious. Beckett's Waiting for Godot, first performed in French in 1953, placed two figures beside a tree and made non-arrival the central event. Godot never comes, which is precisely the point. Absurdity here isn't silliness, it's metaphysics after certainty has left the room. Heaney, in poems such as Bogland and the Bog Body poems, listened to buried violence, bone, peat, ritual, Ireland, history underground. Then Rushdie opened Midnight after Empire's roar. Birth met nation, myth met war. His Midnight's Children, published in 1981, linked Salim Sinai's birth at the moment of Indian independence to partition, nationhood, magical realism, and post-colonial memory. Empire survived not only in borders, but in voices, archives, languages, recipes, family legends, and scars. Hybridity isn't a fashionable term here, it's the texture of historical experience. Ishiguro then brought us to Quieter Rooms. The Remains of the Day, winner of the 1989 Booker Prize, lets Stevens the butler look back on service, dignity, repression, and moral blindness. Never Let Me Go from 2005 gave us Kathy H., clones, care, tenderness, and institutional cruelty so polite it nearly passed for normality. Ishiguro's terror is often whispered, not shouted. Then I knew English literature was no single road. Epic, pilgrimage, drama, novel, poem, code. This final insight is worth keeping because it turns a list of authors into a history of forms. English literature moves from oral heroic poetry to manuscript culture, from multilingual medieval England to vernacular confidence, from pilgrimage narrative to print, from Renaissance drama to epic theology, from satire to the novel, from romantic inwardness to Victorian realism, from modernist fragmentation to dystopia, absurd drama, postcolonial memory, and contemporary fiction of identity and forgetting. It's not merely great books. It's the record of how language survives power, how genres mutate, how voices become audible, and how memory fights oblivion.
Not always lost by fire, nor conquest, nor flame, only asking through the dark. Remember what remains. That's the final imperative. Cultures don't lose memory only through war or burning libraries. They lose it through censorship, comfort, decorum, boredom, convenience, and the quiet decision not to listen. English literature, at its best, returns us to the remnant, the monster-haunted hall, the monk's page, the pilgrim's joke, the tyrant's grammar, the bog body, the butler's silence, the child who was never meant to be fully human. To remember what remains isn't nostalgia, it's an ethical act. It means listening where power has edited, where silence has settled, and where the human voice still asks to be heard.
If you found this exploration of literature compelling, consider sharing it with someone.